Welcome back to another episode, all. Throughout this episode, I'm going to discuss the question, is neurodiversity and autism just a social fad? Well, the brief answer is basically no. But what is a social fad is psychiatry. That's what's become the social fad. If you allow me to quote someone called Dr. Alan Francis, I quote, "Putting aside all the problems with DSM-5, the simple fact is that psychiatric diagnosis has become way too loose. Today, 25% of Americans meet the criteria for a diagnosis in any given year. 25% of us take psychotropic medication. That's 1 in 5 people. We now have more deaths in emergency rooms from prescription drugs than from street drugs. Pill popping is rampant, along with all the unnecessary side effects of drugs. This new DSM will just make this worse." DSM-5 went wrong because its experts were given free rein to expand their pet diagnosis. Experts always worry about missed patients and under-treatment, never about mislabeling normal or over-treatment. Suggestions for new diagnoses that worked for them in their carefully researched practice are usually a disaster when over-applied in regular clinical practice. DSM-5-TR not only failed to correct the diagnostic exuberance of DSM-5, it added an additional best of its own. Some small improvements in DSM-5-TR do not make up for the disaster of including prolonged grief. Publishing DSM-5-TR is further proof that the APA cannot be trusted to properly supervise the DSMs. We need a diagnostic system untainted by APA's huge financial conflict of interest built into its role as publisher. End of quote. Altogether, psychiatry has become more of a money scam, rather than actually seeking an accurate diagnosis of any kind of disability, mental health disorder, etc. Rather than actually trying to seek an accurate diagnosis, it's all about selling diagnosis so they can sell interventions and sell drugs. Approximately 70% of the American population are on antidepressants at the minute. Why are so many drugs being sold that were not being sold in the past? So we see that this comes into the drug industries, and even as recently as the 90s, we had autistic individuals being tranquilized at dosages which were now classified over 12 times the maximum. It was a big time of experimentation, and they despicably used disabled people, women, black people, all just to do these experiments on, because they thought they were not even real humans. For example, the eugenicists described women as social parasites. Some went as far as that in the eugenics movement. And you find that all of this disorder after disorder is just a result of the eugenics movement, of how much disaster and for financial gain it's all about. Like with autism, as a lot of people are questioning, why is it so broad now? It's so broad because of the autism industrial complex. Just allow me to grab a book from the right. I'll just quote the beginning from it. The autism industrial complex. So we could say this is more like the psychiatric industrial complex, this big social trend going on. So the people saying, I'm autistic, or I'm OCD, etc., actually are worthy of a diagnosis because of this overdiagnosis that Dr. Alan Francis is talking about. So, I quote, "Autism is at an inflection point today. We are poised for a paradigm shift in autism research, education, and therapies. This book initiates that shift and does so superbly. In the autism industrial complex, how branding, marketing, and capital investment turned autism into big business. We'll learn about the history and evolution of this multi-billion-dollar per year operation. Thanks to this history, we will remember Lovaas, ABA, and behaviorism in general, not as a science, but as a branding, rhetoric, and marketing plot that transiently misguided many well-intended parents and professionals, and that in so doing profited, with greed, by preying on our human hopes, our trust in science, and our fears. Close quote. So just like we're in this quote by Elizabeth B. Torres, PhD, she quotes that it's been more of a branding, a rhetoric, and a marketing plot. We can say the same thing about psychiatry, but it's just now a rhetoric and a marketing plot altogether, trying to diagnose more people to make more money. Now, on to the point of where the neurodiversity movement is not a social fad. It often comes off as a social fad by how there's so many people on TikTok and so on, treating it like some social trend, sharing their good experiences. But if you actually want to understand the neurodiversity movement, you should turn to the actual scientists who are actually doing about the neurodiversity movement. Like a few examples is Robert Chapman, a philosopher. You've got Nick Walker. There's Thomas Armstrong and Damian Milton. There's just a few examples altogether. And they're the kind of people you want to turn to, and you'll find that they're not dismissing or disregarding all the difficulties that individuals with a diagnosis experience. Like, I've never heard say neurodiversity advocates say that we should stop medication altogether. I've never heard them say we should stop interventions altogether. I've never heard them say that neurodivergent individuals don't need any support or anything down those lines. And on one of the books I've got by Thomas Armstrong, he even writes out the dark side of neurodiversity. Not just that the dark side is in causing individuals difficulties, but of how these difficulties can affect the lives of others in negative ways. So even the scientists who actually support the neurodiversity movement do acknowledge that there is a dark side to it as well. But there's also a very dark side to not acknowledging it, to sticking with the medical paradigm that we're in. Such as the medical paradigm reduces everything down to just the individual, ignoring all the socio-economic factors, all the environmental factors, all the emotional factors, all the things contributed by the mind, all the things from trauma. All of that is ignored in the medical model, and the medical model is stuck with biostatistics by Francis Galton. Where I mentioned one called Nick Walker. Nick Walker wrote, I quote, "The choice to frame the minds, bodies, and lives of autistic people, or any other neurological minority group, in terms of pathology does not represent an inevitable and objective scientific conclusion, but is merely a cultural value judgment. Similar pathologizing frameworks have been used time and again to lend an aura of scientific legitimacy to all manner of other bigotry, and to the oppression of women, indigenous peoples, people of colour, and queer people, among others. The framing of autism and other minority neurological configurations as disorders or medical conditions begins to lose its aura of scientific authority and objectivity when viewed in this historical context. For some years prior to the American Civil War, the desire of slaves to escape from slavery was diagnosed by some white Southern physicians as a medical disorder called drapetomania." End of quote. So it was considered a medical disorder just to want to escape from slavery, because of the bigotry that black people should be slaves, should be under enslavement. Through this method in the medical model, we've come across things like black people are thick and stupid and will never be as smart as white people. We've come to conclusions like women are both physically and intellectually inferior compared to men, and we found that all of these are resulting in political social justice movements altogether, and all of this results from the eugenics movement, such as why were black people seen as people with such low IQ, you've got to ask. It was all due to cultural bias altogether, because the IQ tests which get used are all biased. So altogether, individuals seen as intellectually disabled may not be seen as intellectually disabled if you measure intelligence in an alternative way, such as the RSPM test and the WICS test. On the WICS test, we found that non-autistic people do better, but on the RSPM, autistic people, including those with intellectual disabilities, are 40% faster and more accurate than non-autistic people. So which one's more intelligent? Who's got the higher IQ? We can see here it all depends on which test do you use. So you see that intellectual ability itself is biased. So by basing everything just on things like genes and so on, we found that it's great reductionism, the medical model is, by thinking everything's just to do with the individual. Mentioned Dr. Damian Milton did. In 2012, Dr. Damian Milton proposed the double empathy problem. And we've come to find that the double empathy problem, it does tend to work out that it's a two-directional problem concerning social matters. But it's not the autistic people with social deficits, but it's just that they have social differences of where it goes in both directions. Non-autistic people find it just as difficult to communicate and interact with autistic people. So, who's got the social deficits altogether? We can't say legitimately. There's no legitimate way to say that one's more social than the other, if we don't break the rules of science. So, altogether we're finding that specific groups of people under this medical model, we're just coming to illegitimate, delusional conclusions because of the reductionism. And this is what the neurodiversity paradigm is competing against. It's asking us for a better way, like what Nick Walker said about neurominorities. It's saying that we shouldn't automatically label a difference as a pathological disorder. So it's demanding a better way of how to discern. Is something actually a deficit, disease, and so on? Or is it just a general difference? Yeah. Well, what is it? Is it just a difference? Or is it something else? Or actually, is it something damaging? For example, in autism, for example, why does monotropism have to be seen as a deficit? What's so harmful about it? Why can't we just see that as just a difference? I would say when it comes to things like anxiety, considering to how overwhelmingly they get anxious, of how some individuals on the spectrum can't even walk out the front door of their own home, I would say that allows that it's not just a difference there. So I would say that's something that needs to be addressed, but monotropism, just having fewer interests, I don't see anything harmful about that, to go labelling that as some kind of deficit. So what it's asking us, the neurodiversity paradigm and the neurodiversity movement, is to stop just labelling differences as disorders. And because differences have been labelled disorders, that's why the DSM has become so wide and become so loose in its definitions, because diversity is the general norm. That's what is normal. It's normal to be diverse to one another, but now that we're labelling diversity as deficits, everyone qualifies to be diagnosed with a deficit. As one of the criticisms towards the DSM system by so many psychiatrists is it can potentially diagnose every human with a disorder of what it currently is. If you just allow me to turn to another book, but there's even some psychiatrists who have abandoned the concept of it altogether, of diagnosis. Just give me enough time to find the right page. Yeah. Right, here it is. From The Myth of Normal by Dr. Gabriel Mater. I quote, "The psychiatrist, author and leading trauma researcher Bruce Perry has come to disdain diagnosis almost completely. This is no knee-jerk prejudice. His dim view of the norms and practices of his field follows decades spent assessing tens of thousands of troubled children, and extensive contributions to the vast literature on adversity and what we define as disorders. When I got into psychiatry, Dr. Perry told me, it became clear really quickly that the diagnoses were not connected to the physiology, that they were just descriptive, and that there were hundreds of physiological roots to somebody having an attention problem, for example. And yet the profession acted as if these descriptive labels were really a thing. I knew that if we were doing research, if we were using these hollow descriptors, which we call diagnosis, and then study interventions and outcomes, we would just get garbage, and that's what we've done." These days, Dr. Perry is adamant that even playing the DSM game is completely wrong. When invited to contribute to one of the manual's editions, he refused. I said, "Listen, in 25 years they are going to look back and won't believe that we thought about people that way. It's not a valid way to think about the complexities of human beings." He practices what he preaches in the clinic he helps run. "We haven't used diagnosis for 15, 20 years, he said, and it really has not interfered with our ability to do good clinical work. In fact, we're able to do better clinical work without using those labels." End of quote. So I'd say altogether, the DSM system which Dr. Bruce Perry is talking about here, he's almost come to stop using it almost completely, because he knows of the other diagnoses, just like Dr. Alan Francis and so many other psychiatrists. And I'd just like to quickly read out a study which is on a previous page. Right, I quote, "Why then do I persist in my critique of the diagnostic model? Because diagnostic reveal nothing about the underlying events and dynamics that animate the perceptions and experiences in question. They keep our gaze trained on effects and not their myriad causes. There could be multiple reasons why a child may have trouble paying attention or be restless, disengaged, and fidgety, anxiety, stresses at home, boredom with material she finds uninteresting, resistance to the constraints of sitting in a classroom, fear of bullying, an authoritarian teacher, trauma, even birth month, believe it or not." A University of British Columbia study looked at the prescription records of almost 1 million BC school children over an 11-year period and found that kids born in December were 39% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than classmates born the previous January. The reason? December kids entered the same grade nearly a year younger than their January counterparts. They were 11 months behind in brain development. They were being medicated, not for a genetic brain disorder, but for naturally delayed maturation of the brain circuits of attention and self-regulation. End of quote. So see once again, statistics, basing it on statistical deviation, has brought them to wrong conclusions and has made them misdiagnose and mismedicate which explains more of the overdiagnosis. So altogether, the fad that's going on is psychiatry altogether, and neurodiversity is challenging this by making us question, should this difference actually be seen as some kind of deficit or dysfunction? Such as if we look at take a few approaches of how things go on, you'll sometimes come to see that disability emerges from groups of people. It doesn't emerge from one individual. You'll find sometimes it comes from the environment and not actually the individual. And you'll find sometimes it's just due to circumstances and not the individual. You'll find that disability, disorder, etc. are not biologically deterministic, but that's the way the medical model treats it. As long as we stay on the medical model the way it currently is, they're just going to keep making money by selling disorders, by coming to these delusional conclusions, such as the conclusion that opposing slavery is a medical disorder, because that was against the social norm. That feminism today, people are seen as man-haters. Not just by men, but by women as well. Other women see feminists as man-haters. And you find that all of them, and this is what the neurodiversity movement's challenging. It's challenging all the bigotry that is involved in the science itself. Because if you look through the DSM, you come to find it's a list of social biases. So if you don't fit a social norm altogether, you'll automatically be diagnosed as someone with a disorder, and you'll be medicated for it. As I would say, 70% on antidepressants, over 20% on psychotropic pills, more people dying of prescriptive drugs than drug abuse. I would say all of this is providing great evidence that there is a big overdiagnosis. And the overdiagnosis doesn't come down to people doing self-diagnosis. All these diagnoses I'm referring to are by the professionals. Because in the medical records, they don't include self-diagnosis. So the 20% that Dr. Alan Francis mentioned, that's just those with a professional diagnosis. But then what if you add those with a self-diagnosis onto that? But they only pass a diagnosis because of what the diagnostic criteria says. They're not just going and saying and making up, oh, I'm autistic. They're not just making that up, that's what the diagnostic criteria says. The DSM claims they are autistic. So it's not the individual self-diagnosing who are to blame. As both Bruce Perry and Dr. Gabriel Maté said, the DSM does not address causation. So do these people with a diagnosis of autism actually have autism? Do they have the genes which have been associated with autism? Do they have the neurological differences that have been associated with autism? Does being part of a minority actually equate to disorder? Are humans just a list of statistics? Is that what humans really are? So the neurodiversity movement altogether is not a social trend, but it's about trying to correct all this money scam going on in the science community. About things like psychiatry are just selling disorders so they can sell drugs. Just selling disorders so they can sell interventions. But you'll find when you turn to the people I've mentioned, such as Robert Chapman, Nick Walker, Damian Milton, Thomas Armstrong, you'll find that they're not going and saying that no support or help is needed. So where you get some people saying, oh, if you want this treatment, you're a Nazi. If you want to do it through eugenics, then yes, you can be equated as a Nazi. If you want to do it in an eugenics way, perform genocide through eugenics. It's simply what someone called Rosemary calls velvety eugenics, since you're not doing it through murder, but are simply doing it by disallowing certain people to come into the world. Then They're not against things like medication, those in the neurodiversity movement. Like, they haven't gone saying we shouldn't help control people's epileptic seizures. They don't go saying that there's no such thing as disorder, disability, etc. What they say is that some parts in the diagnostic criteria of the DSM are not deficits at all. Like where I mentioned having fewer interest, that's simply just something against the social norm. So why does being against the social norm need to be seen as a disorder? That's just more bigotry in the science community. Claim that any minority is a disorder. That's just bigotry in the science community. And that's what the neurodiversity movement's trying to correct. And it's trying to restore social justice. Just like we're trying to get racial justice, gender equality, and all the other justice movements, but we see that all of these resulted from the racist, sexist, ableist, eugenics movement of 3 white Europeans going and claiming they want to produce paradise on earth, which would be what do you think 3 racist snobs would want it to be? Who went doing forced sterilisation, who caused World War II, who caused loss of hundreds of millions of lives. And all of these 3 are behind the statistics that you use today in modern science. So modern science all lays upon these 3 men. So should we really be basing health upon just statistics alone? Or do we need a paradigm shift and actually go to a new way to challenge this bigotry that is inside the science community? Because that's basically what the neurodiversity movement is challenging. It's challenging the bigotry that still lies within there. Claims like women are social parasites. Claims like black people are intellectually inferior compared to white people. All the people being sent into psychiatric hospitals that don't need to. Trying to stop all the murder that's been going on. Because disabled people on any disability studies have actually been murdered in autism research. Such as in the 90s, but there was even an individual where there were, if you just allow me to find the part, but there was a certain individual who was working and looking at medications, giving psychotic pills to autistic individuals, but it's really upsetting what she goes and says. This is by someone called Dino Morea, who opened a big movement inside the 90s to put a stop to all the medication. I quote, "The period when our people had been hospitalised was a period of excited experimentation with new drugs, and the doctors really had no idea what they were doing when they prescribed doses of chlorpheniramine, an antipsychotic, to children which would later be regarded as around 12 times the recommended maximum. I was in tears too." End of quote. Applying dosages of drugs just on autistic kids. Then there's the Feminine Boy Project, because a feminine boy didn't fit the social norm. When trying to convert him to being a boy, and they used that to make money, and on top of making money, also early below that, gay conversion therapy, claim that LGBTQ are pathological. So altogether, psychiatry is just a marketing plot. That's what it is today. So it's not individuals who are saying things like, I've got OCD, I've got autism, I've got this, I've got that. They're not the ones responsible for this. It's the DSM system, it's psychiatry that is responsible for it. Because it's the psychiatrists who are actually going and saying, yes, you're worthy of an autism diagnosis. You're worthy of a diagnosis of this, diagnosis of that, so they can sell more drugs. So the trend going on, the bad trend the social fad, is actually by the psychiatric community, all of them together for their financial gain. So this is why I would say you should jump on board with the neurodiversity movement, because they're not against treatment, they're not against helping and supporting disabled people, they don't claim there's no such thing as support, but it's a big challenge against the bigotry that lies within the science community altogether. It's a big protest against all the financial gain, the lies that they tell, to get the funding to do their research, to fuel their bigotry. So I see the neurodiversity movement as a great movement forward, as it's also the polar opposite of the racist eugenics movement. And with biotechnology advancing, we are at a stage where they want to start a second eugenics movement, and I've even written to them, the ones behind all the genome research and the Human Genome Project. They go saying, oh, we'll answer anyone's questions, but they won't answer mine. I asked them, why do you approve of aborting fetuses just because they'll be born with Down syndrome? Why do you approve of that? That's eugenics, I told them, but they won't answer. I said, oh, you're going and saying you've got clinical websites all over, saying it's a great hope we're going to get rid of ADHDers. I said, well, isn't that eugenics once again? And they refused to answer. So you've got clinical websites saying you want to do it to autistic people. How's that not eugenics? And they refused to answer. So it shows that they do know they are guilty, showing that we know that they are no less susceptible than Francis Galton, Carl Pearson and Ronald Fisher of all the bigotry in the science community, including on genetics. So those in the science community today are no better than Francis Galton, Carl Pearson and Ronald Fisher. If racism was still condoned today rather than condemned, that today's scientists would approve of disallowing black people to come into the world. That's what they would do. If that's the way things were still seen. If the LGBTQ was still seen as pathological, they'd disallow the LGBTQ to come into the world. So, who should get to decide overall who's entitled to life and who's not? From my view, that's not a human's choice. Everyone should be entitled to life. Please may share your thoughts with me in the comments section. And if you made it this far, thank you for listening.